Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest is Professor Anita Hill, and we're going to be talking about the new movie, Anita, Speaking Truth to Power.
Thank you for having me.
It's
This
great.
is really exciting.
It's very exciting. What about this documentary?
Well, the documentary started as a project about 4 years ago. Interestingly, the film crew with director Frida Lee Mock came with me to Burlington, Vermont on Martin Luther King Day. I was speaking there, and that was the first time we actually started filming. And then 3 years later, last year, the show premiered at Sundance at the film festival. Now there's a backstory, of course, to all of that. This is just sort of fast forwarding to the end, isn't it? But it's been an interesting process. It's not something that I had ever done before, and so having a camera follow you around is not always relaxing. But when you see the film, it is quite revealing of so many things that are going on in my life in those 3 years and my life leading up to that.
Yeah. Well, you're a private person. Were you skeptical at all about opening yourself and your family up in this way?
Oh, absolutely. I had been approached by different filmmakers, and I was just skeptical about the whole idea of it. But there are a couple of things that sort of led me to the conclusion that this was a good project to undertake. You know, we live in a visual era. And I am especially aware of it because I am on a campus, a university campus all the time, and I see young people, and I see how they communicate with the world and how the world communicates back with them. And they like video. That's the era that we're living in. And I knew that if this story was going to be told to a new generation, that we needed something like a film to make a record and to show not only the private side of me, which there is some of that, but also really as importantly, or maybe more importantly for the audience, the public issues that my life has come to reflect.
Which brings us to 1991 and the Senate confirmation hearings. When you were growing up in Oklahoma, could you have ever imagined such a year?
No. And even now when I look back on it, there are some parts of it that are absolutely surreal to me. 1991 was just the hearings themselves were just amazing. They were disturbing. They were evocative in so many ways of the experiences that people had in their own lives. And then what happened after the hearings, for me, is the amazing part of the story. What happened to me personally, but also what happened to the country as we started talking about sexual misconduct, whether in the workplace or in the military or in all of these different venues. So it's a story that gets told in about 90 minutes in this documentary, which makes it exciting to see unfold in such a powerful way.
I think one thing I'd like to emphasize is that you didn't just suddenly volunteer to speak out against Clarence Thomas.
Oh, absolutely not again. I think that one of the common misconceptions, and part of that is perpetuated by the process, where you in fact had one senator saying that I had just sort of came up out of nowhere and then said things anonymously, and none of that is true. I was actually approached by the Senate on several occasions and asked specific questions, and then subpoenaed to testify at the hearing. So there was a process in which I was approached by Senate staffers to give information about Clarence Thomas. And so it wasn't as though I just volunteered and said, this is what I want to do. And one of the reasons that I didn't volunteer was that I was skeptical of the process. And as it turns out, I had a right to be.
At what point did you decide to take a lie detector test?
so much had been made of it, and there were senators who even said to me, well, will you take a lie detector test? And I think that was sort of course, blustering and bluffing, and I think they assumed that I wouldn't do it. And midway, after I testified on Friday, those questions kept coming up. And on Sunday morning, after my testimony, I went and took a lie detector test with a former FBI head of that division, Paul Miner, delivered the test. And then there's a public press conference in which he talks about the results of that test. And that's in the film.
See, that's why this film is so powerful and such an important part of history. Did Clarence Thomas take a lie detector test?
No, he didn't. He declined to take one, and no one really questioned that. I mean, the senators at the time never said, well, she did take a lie detector test, and Mr. Thomas has declined. I think we sort of just left that in the air. And so, that's one of the things that comes up again and again. But it's also, interestingly, something that sometimes people forget. That I did take that lie detector test, and it wasn't as though it was a test that just anybody delivered. We didn't find someone who we didn't. Again, there was never any effort to try to stack the deck in my favor. We went out and we got one of the leading experts to deliver the test, and he came out really very strongly, saying that there was absolutely no evidence of any fabrication on my part.
And weren't there other women willing to testify?
I keep saying that there were two things that the Senate especially did wrong. One, they did not call 3 women who were waiting to testify about their own experience of harassment. And I think that was a travesty. It was a travesty for all women, but especially it was a disservice for those 3 women who were ready and available, ready to put their statements and their lives on the line. And the Senate just did not call them. They refused to call them. They put introduced their statements into the record. But as you know, there is nothing so powerful as having the people see those witnesses and see them talking and saying what happened. And there were echoes of my experience in the things that they did have to say. The other thing that the Senate didn't do was to call expert witnesses. Now, and people say, well, why was that necessary? Well, it was important because we have to remember that our process of confirmation is an information gathering process. It's an information gathering process for the Senate, but it's also for the public, so that the public understands the issues that are being raised. And there were so many misconceptions about sexual harassment at the time that they really needed people who had been doing research and work in these issues for years to come forward and talk about it, so that they explained the behavior in a way that was research-based, that was evidence-based. It would have been a great service to the public, as well as to the process itself. And the Senate refused, or at least failed to do that. I know for a fact that there were experts ready to be called, and I know the names of the experts.
It's amazing. I was watching you during the testimony, and you were just unflappable. Where did you get your strength? People were saying very unkind things.
Unkind is a nice way to put it. But that's, again, where the film is important, because when Frida Mock approached me, I knew that she was the one to do this film, because I felt that she would be the one to tell the story about my family and my upbringing. And when people ask that question that you just asked, where did you get the strength? The scene of my parents and my family coming into the hearing room really says it all. That's the answer to the question. My mother, starting with her, my father, all of my siblings, and the way that I grew up in Oklahoma, that's really where it came from. It's I say that I had the good fortune to be born in 1956, in an era of great promise. And really, a lot of it was lived out in my home, where in 1956 we were just starting to make real the promise of equality, whether it's for women or African American and all people of color. It was just starting to develop because of the civil rights movement, because of the women's rights movement. And I walked into a life where that was opening up. And my parents, however, my mother and father were born at the turn of the 20th century. So they had experienced the worst of bias and, discrimination. And so they had that steel that comes from going through the harsh times. And they passed on that steel to all of us. And so I say that I had the steel that came from coming up or being raised by parents who'd grown up through hard times, but then I had the blessing of coming into a world that was changing for the better.
It must have been painful for you, though, and for them, to all be there together and hear some of the things that were said.
It was painful. It was, and you see, at one point, my father comes out of the hearing, and he's just hurt, and as you can imagine, any parent would be. And I've dealt with fathers who've dealt with these issues. I think it's very hard on them because they cannot protect their daughters. They can't protect their children. He couldn't protect me from the harsh things that were being said. Nevertheless, as hard as it was, they absolutely knew that they were going to be there for me.
It's wonderful.
They wouldn't be anyplace else.
We're showing a picture of them together holding your picture during that time. And when I saw that, my heart just swelled. You had to be so proud to know you had that kind of support system. But when the Senate ultimately confirmed Thomas, what message did that send to you, to the rest of the country?
I think it sent a message that they were not really ready to deal with the truth of my experience. And unfortunately, what it meant for a lot of women, and Barbara Mikulski talks about them, is that they weren't ready to deal with the truth of a lot of women's experiences. That we had presented to them, myself and the other witnesses, what the reality of the workplace is when sexual harassment is allowed to persist. And what they said is that there are no consequences to bad behavior and to misconduct. And I also think it said that unfortunately they didn't really see that as that kind of behavior as relevant to a determination of whether someone is fit for high office. And I think, especially when you're talking about an office where you're going to sit in judgment on precisely these kinds of cases. And it's a lifetime appointment. So it's not like a judge on the Supreme Court can be unelected. So I don't think they understood the gravity of what they were doing, that committing someone to a lifetime appointment to judge the very kinds of cases that I was bringing to them, to judge those and to sit in judgment of women across the country. I think that they just weren't able to deal with it, and it was to me it was a message of dismissing our real lives, our real experiences.
Do you think that the hearings would play out differently today?
That's such a hard question because I'm not sure if we could even have those same hearings. I think what we learned, we've come such a long way. And I hear now from women who were roughly my age at the time of the hearings, and they're talking about, now we can talk to our daughters. Now, I have a daughter who is coming into work in her own career, And I think our consciousness has raised to the point where there would be so many steps before we got to that point, so much more vetting, that we wouldn't have those hearings. But let's not kid ourselves. Every day in this country, there are hearings that are taking place on these very issues. And so what I'd like people to do as they watch the film is to think about whether those hearings that are occurring today, when women come forward, whether they're in a university setting, or when they come forward, are the hearings that we have in place today about getting to the truth? Or are they simply about making sure that we don't have to make tough choices?
That's well said. Clarence Thomas has written a memoir.
Oh, absolutely.
And in it, he calls you traitorous.
Yes.
Have you read the book?
I haven't read it cover to cover, but I've certainly read parts of it.
How do you feel when something like that comes out and someone from the past brings up the issue again in a hurtful way?
It's still hurtful. It's still hurtful. It's even when I watch the hearings and I think about how young I was and how vulnerable I was. I think what happens, though, is that you learn to process it and you understand this raw abuse of power that continues. But I also feel that with all of the people I have heard from in the past 20, 30 years, with their own experiences, I don't feel alone. And there is comfort in knowing that there are other people who believe in you. But there's also a challenge when you say, you know what, I don't want this to happen to anybody else. And so I'm challenged by those kinds of comments to make sure that this doesn't happen to other women and other men, now that we're learning about what harassment can take place in the NFL locker room.
In your own memoir, Speaking Truth to Power, you write that you think the hearings will be with you for the rest of your life. Now, you wrote that several years ago. Do you still feel that way?
They will. And one of the things that I have learned to do is to embrace what I've learned from those hearings. You know, it's funny because you see the hearings and it seems so remote. You talk about the U.S. Senate. But what I love about this film is that it shows that these processes, even something as remote as a Senate hearing, will have impact on people's personal lives. They're not just political processes that happen out there and just impact the people in Washington. They change people's lives. My life has been changed by those hearings, and that's evident from the film. But the question then is, do you take that and make something positive out of it? And that's what I've been trying to do and will continue to try to do. And so yes, the hearings will be a part of me for as long as I live.
Do you ever wish 1991 just hadn't happened?
I wish that there were things that had been done differently, but I also believe that God has a purpose for all of us and that there is a reason that it happened. And I am also encouraged that so many people talk to me and they say, it changed my life. It gave me the strength to go forward. It helped me understand what had happened to me in the past. And I hear that over and over again. So no, I don't wish it away. I wish that the Senate had been more understanding. I wish the Senate had served the public better, but I don't wish it didn't happen.
Frida Mock is an Academy Award-winning director. What was she able to say with the documentary that you weren't able to say in your book?
She was able to bring us forward. In Speaking Truth to Power, what I did was to try to explain at that moment in the mid-90s, this is where I am now, this is what happened in 1991. But in the documentary, we don't get stuck in 1991. We don't get stuck in 1995. She brings it to a new generation, and she talks to some young women There's a woman who's featured in the film, Joanne Smith, who runs an organization called Girls for Gender Equity. And it's a program where they actually go into, with young women who are high school and college age, talking to junior high school girls about the problems they face. And that's just one of the things that has come out of the hearings and it's developed since the hearings that I don't capture at all in my book because it was written 20 years ago, nearly 20 years ago. So that's really beautiful to see what young women are talking about, what they care about, and what they're doing to take control of their lives.
Did doing this documentary with Frida give you any new insights into your own life?
Well, it confirmed that I do not like having a camera follow me around. That it's not always fun, and being in that moment when you're answering questions and you think back and you say, oh, I could have been much clearer about that. But it also did give me some insight into, I think, what we need to do and a vision that we have to have for how the world can be changed for better. And as a lawyer, we want people to be aware of the law, and we want women to understand what their rights are. And I think we had always, our approach really to the issues of workplace misconduct and Title IX, what's happening in the university, had been, let's teach women what their choices are. Let's get them to speak out when these problems occur. And it occurred to me after watching this and seeing how people are struggling, is that we need to have a new vision. Not just that we inform young women about what their rights are and how to raise a complaint and what the processes are for that, but how about a vision for the schools, for the workplaces, where sexual harassment and sexual misconduct doesn't occur. So that we're not always saying, you're going to go into the workplace and this is what's going to happen. We warn them that it could happen, but we envision a workplace where it's a rarity instead of the norm.
And when you first started experiencing sexual harassment, did you really know how to deal with it?
I absolutely didn't, because people didn't talk about it.
No.
It happened to so many women. We didn't talk about it. My mother really didn't work in a workplace outside of the home. You know, she was a farmer and she worked on the farm. So she personally hadn't experienced it. But even then, for women who had, they didn't talk to their daughters. So we didn't know what was happening. And so it was really shocking, and in some ways it was how it was able to keep happening, because we didn't tell each other, and we personalized it and we internalized it and we blamed ourselves. That has certainly changed, but we still need to go a long way to keep it to keep it in abeyance.
Tell us about your life today.
My life today is it's a good life. It's a good life.
It shows.
Thank you. I work very hard at it, and I like working hard, so that's good. I teach and I do administration at Brandeis University.
You write?
I write. I get to speak to the public. And I care about a variety of issues. I care about equality generally. I care about, people talk about sexual harassment, and yes, I do care about it, but I know that there are so many ways that we need to start to confront the inequalities that women especially experience, whether it's in the workplace or it's, in domestic violence or, in the military branches. So these are the things that, even things like healthcare, it's a bundle of, in fact, in March, I'm going through a conference where we're finally starting to get healthcare institutions. on the board of a women's health care center at Brigham and Women's Hospital under the direction of Dr. Paula Johnson. And we're having a conference to talk about just getting equal funding for research on women's health issues. We have laws in place that says there should be equity in the funding of research, the dollars that come out of our government, but we have not reached any kind of parity in just that basic right that's in the law, enshrined in the law. And so we've got to figure out how we can do that. So there's so many issues that are out there, and I just feel really blessed to be able to be a part of them and to work with so many people, smart people who are trying to bring us there.
We just have a few seconds left, and we're showing a photo of your parents from their 60th wedding anniversary. If you could visit with them just one more time, what would you like to say to them?
Thank you. Thank you for everything that they have given me. And that I think I would also say, I am going to do everything that I can to honor their legacy, the gifts that they've given me, the strength that they've given me, and the faith that they've given me that things will ultimately be right.
Thank you so much for being with us, Anita, and thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.